thank to the team of the School of Global Languages, and of course at the Department of Romance Languages for making this forum possible. This presentation is a kind of excerpt from an essay in progress about the novel Estrella distante, Distant Star by Roberto Bolaño, which is part of my work about the social construction of subjectivity in cultural objects from the 20 and 21st in Latin America. This novel serves to me like a kind of axis or constellation, methodological and theoretical problems in development. The shining atmospheres of violence, ethics, aesthetics, and subjectivity in Roberto Bolaño's Estrella distante. 1. Bolaño's work enjoys rich and growing criticism, as numerous as his work and the topics he works on. However, there are ideas that I can trace in all his books. I highlight ethics, aesthetics, and subjectivity as concepts that allow me to weave a dialogue about the constitution of Latin American subjectivity. I propose a kind of controversy, hypothesis, speculation. What can I perceive of Latin American subjectivity through these stories and narratives? What do ethics and aesthetics say about subjectivity? But not the obvious. That's why I focus on that shining atmosphere, a category of the Chilean philosopher Hugo Zemelman. And above all, what has become of the Latin American subject and the violence that has been inscribed in their subjectivity. 2. Estrella distante, Distant Star, is a testament to its time. Bolaño, a sort of chronicler and ethnographer of the writer of his generation. He used the aesthetic exercise of writing to discover that the practice of writing, as his ancestor of the Latin American book did, is a form of political and literary militancy. Conceptual clarification. In this novel, ethics and aesthetics are constantly enunciated as a correlate of the evil that surrounds the whole novel, and at the same time, recreate a space where subjectivity is realized. What do I understand by subjectivity? It's the web of perceptions and conception that guide and orient the subject. I understand Bolaño's work as a critique in the Foucaultian sense, that is, questioning that governance, what guides us teleologically, and that in the case of the Chilean writer is expressed in a kind of literary fiction criticism. Estrella distante, Distant Star, is a novel that used the narrative counterpoint to tell the vicissitudes of a group of Chilean poets during the Pinochet dictatorships and their corresponding destinies as victims of violence, during forced migration, state terrorism, and above all, the story tells us the excesses of a military man with the pretension of an avant-garde poet who collaborated as a victimizer of the regime. The corollary of the novel is the hunt and subsequent execution of this character. From the beginning of the book, we find a clarification. The novel plays with the idea of the manuscript found and the manuscript made with 4 hands. This note not only plays with those ideas, but also with the commonplace of those novels that cross between autofiction, testimony, and half history. Bolaño prefers to mask and use, as in other of his stories, some of his characters, that they are friends of the past, who are also containers of stories and especially of experiences out of reality and susceptible to becoming narration. In a certain way, every manuscript is made by 4 hands if we think about society. In that sense, this not only plays, in just the story, in the community that dictates all story. In that sense, every kind of work is a kind of compilation of some kind of subjectivity. It's a whole. The introductory note is a clarification that is supposedly not part of the narrative. But if I read as a whole, like I told you, it's part of the novel because Bolaño is doing the making exercise, this masking exercise. That is, the writer frames the story, contextualizes it. The note is an internal paratext that gives the narrative a situated quality full of sense of reality. Above all, the note matters to me because it is the starting point to situate the reader in the real history. That is, the author seems to be telling us like, this is not a novel, this is a fictionalized testimony or testimonies. In that sense, Estrella distante, like I told you, is a territory of critical fiction. The writer uses the resource of false testimony, which is nothing more than how the writer crosses reality with fiction with the purpose of, through an aesthetic exercise, showing a reality difficult to understand, as in the case of certain socio-political problems such as assassination in dictatorships and other ways in which violence is exercised through terrorism of a state. From the introduction of the book, we find the Bolañesco game of the meta-literature. The writer refers to the literatura nazi in America, the Nazi literature in America, and the tale or fragment that was the starting point for Estrella distante, the distant star. In the language of present, I will say that Estrella distante is a kind of a spin-off of the Bolaño universe. In this work and many others of Bolaño, we can get a kind of creative writing workshop, an aesthetic workshop that is interested in the record for posterity of human atrocities. It seems that more by pure arbitrariness of life turned into a political and ethical task that the exiled writer has no choice but to choose that phase of life, that of being an outcast of the earth, and it is up to him to a kind of map, like his own characters who prefers maps to books. But nobody is exiled for pleasure. One is exiled because of violence, and exile in its process produces even more violence. In different forms, precariousness, poverty, xenophobia, among others. Bolaño decides, even in that context, both socially and personally, to represent that is, he makes an ethical and aesthetic decision at the same time. What do I mean by ethics? A way of being and being in the world that respects all forms of life, and that if it is treated or has been eliminated, seeks to respect it and give it a place of dignity. What do I mean by aesthetics? A phenomenological synthesis about the act of creation. In that ethical and aesthetic sense, they intersect and cannot be one without the other because it is necessary, through the act of creation, to consider them as a political synthesis of the expression of the subject. 3. Another conceptual clarification. In the case of Bolaño, his work has an aesthetic dimension because he is a creator, a literary artist, and a reader that proposes a kind of canon, like Alan Paul proposes. At the same time, his creative work reaches an ethical dimension because he must represent, or wants to represent, a certain horror, so that is not forgotten, and at the same time, tell the story of certain characters that are real or not part of that he calls the folklore of exile, of the personal mythologies of the communities, of that diachronic syntax of the nation. But that being of the order of collective invention does not mean that they are not real, as is the case of the numbers of deaths in social outbreaks that are statistics always debated between the state, as official count of deaths, the media, and finally the social and family organizations that are dedicated to searching for the disappeared. As always, the biopolitics applied by the state make its own and tells its own story. Faced with this reality, Bolaño acts in some way as an historian and aesthete. What else can the subject saturated with historicity to do? Well, record, systematize, be a witness of his time even when the speculative becomes reality. Bolaño says in the novel, everything enters the field of conjectures. Just, I can add through Josefina Ludmer, the Argentinian critic, that everything enters the field of speculation, but another kind of speculation, that one that interests me and is the one that manufactures reality. But it also enters the function of the situated subject. That saturation of historicity is that is aesthetically transmitted through that I call shining atmosphere, and I take from the Chilean philosopher Hugo Zemelman. Zemelman says about shining atmospheres, what is that is beyond what cannot be signified by a clear name of identity, but which demands to be named. How to say that to have a presence requires breaking with intelligible, finished, and accepted forms. How to say what claims to be meaningful, but can never be because meaning dilutes it. Here, the discourse is not focused on predicates, but on verbs. How can one think in a language of social talk the shining atmospheres of Pedro Páramo by Rulfo, or Machu Picchu by Neruda or Mata's painting? How to read socially the dance of culture of the continent? How to read these realities in the discourse of hope? How to make ethics a component of a thought that thinks through many languages? The problems that concern us is the challenge represented by the movement of the historically situated subject. End quote. Bolaño represents that annotator, this movement of the historically situated subject. He is the executor of the paint of the subject movement, because he not only records the historically situated subject, but also he is a kind of historically situated subject. Bolaño goes from being an ethnographer of the tribe of poets of Latin American literature as a community, as a nation, to literature as a society without a state, like Piglia says. He goes from describing a certain version of reality to becoming, and in these lines, a reference for interpretation. All this is part of the same metatextual, intertextual game well learned by Bolaño in Borges' work. An exercise that certainly takes it more from reality and its complexity than from literature itself. Mimesis is not a gift, it is more of the order of our existential nature. Finally, if something interests me, it is that in the act of writing a novel, building a series of characters is somehow a kind of sociology or kind of ethnography. Stories that agency and deploy a subjectivity, which can be seen as the decision not from a writer, of course, but dictated from a society. A story taken from reality, full of events and truths. It is also, in Bolaño's work, part of the culture of exile. I mean, Bolaño as a critique of ethos, but also as a historian of his time. Critique of power and evil, witness of that nobody saw, and for not seeing, you must imagine it, to have a testimony, and above all, to do the work of the Latin American writer, to be the witness of the shining atmosphere of violence. Thank you.